Some of you may know I'm Professor Kareem Usher. I'm faculty in city and regional planning. My research area is food justice, food access. This evening we have Dr. Alkon, is Associate Professor in Sociology at University of the Pacific and also co-founding member of their master's program in food studies. She's located, which is located in the San Francisco campus. She's co-author of Cultivating Food Justice with Julian Eggerman, author of Black, White, and Green: Farmers Markets, Race, and the Green Economy, and co-author of The New Food Activism with Julie Gottman, which is expected out from the University of California Press this coming spring. She has also written and published many journal articles on food justice, and we've had the pleasure of having two wonderful conversations with her today with students, and look forward to hear her thoughts and have her share her thoughts with you guys today. So let's give Professor Alkon a warm welcome. Thank you.
So I titled the talk Food Justice, Theory and Praxis, and what I want to do today is talk a little bit about the work that I and others have done coming up with a research program around the notion of food justice, and then to offer two practical examples, theoretically informed examples, that I think will be of particular interest to architects and planners. Okay. So, audience participation moment. When you think about food justice, what kinds of issues come to mind? You can just shout them out. Food deserts, absolutely. What else? Poverty. Equity. Farm workers, labor, right? Anything else? Farm economic viability, great. Okay, so this is a partial list of things that I came up with, not in any way comprehensive. But what I wanted to point out is that there's all these kind of disparate issues that are involved in food justice, and part of my work as an academic has been to try and synthesize, think about what are the continuities between these issues and how can we look at it as a field for research. So my favorite definition of food justice actually comes from my graduate student, Rashid Hislop, and there's Rashid up there, gigantically. And he talks about it as the struggle against racism, exploitation, and oppression taking place within the food system that addresses inequalities' root causes both within and beyond the food chain. And there's a few things I really like about this definition. So I like that he names racism explicitly. I think that conversations about inequalities sometimes shy away from naming race, and activism around food justice has really prioritized race as in terms of the way that they're making claims about these inequities. But of course, race is mutually produced with class and national status. There's also issues of gender and sexuality, so racism is not the only form of exploitation and oppression that we're talking about here. I also like that he talks about causes both within and beyond the food chain. Too often in food activism, we think that everything that's wrong is just a product of the food system and can be changed by changing the food system. And I think food justice research and activism really looks at the interplay between the food system and larger social and economic systems that are affecting it. Okay. So from that definition and from all those issues, one of my goals has been to lay out food justice as an enterprise for research, right? If we're academics who want to ask questions about food justice research and who want to ask questions about food justice, these are kind of the questions that I think really synthesize the field as it stands. So how do inequalities like race, class, gender, national status affect the production, distribution, and consumption of food? And how are communities, places, and industries affected by these inequalities, and how do they respond to them? Right? And so these are not questions I or anyone attempts to answer in their entirety, but things that I hope that all of us as a field having these conversations can try to get at. So one of my contributions has been to lay out the theoretical underpinnings for food justice. So what are the areas of scholarship that we need to know about and build on in order to understand food justice and food injustices as they play out? So I talk about 4 areas. There's environmental justice, critical race theory, sustainable agriculture, and food studies. So environmental justice is a field of activist scholarship that revolves around the claim that low-income people and people of color are disproportionately burdened by the toxic consequences of environmental degradation. So while environmentalists have largely talked about how we need to protect the earth for other species or for future generations, folks in the environmental justice movement have said, okay, those things are important, but we also need to think about within the human species and within the current generation, who is unequally burdened, who is more likely to live in places with toxic near toxic land uses, with poor quality housing that's been affected by environmental degradation, that lacks access to things like parks and playgrounds and healthy food that we think of as environmental amenities. Environmental justice has also talked about the intersections of justice and sustainability. So saying that in order for something to be sustainable, it needs to be not only an environmental good, but there also needs to be a social and particularly a social equity dimension to it. So something will not be sustainable if it's not accessible or makes life worse for the majority of people on the planet who are living in limited resource situations. Also, I want to note that environmental justice is where the tradition of activist scholarship in food justice comes from. Food justice scholars are generally very attuned to and interested in the needs of communities suffering from food injustice and the kinds of claims they're making and questions they're asking. And I'm really proud to be a part of a subfield in which that practical dimension of research is rewarded, which is not the case if you know anything about academic sociology more generally. That's most certainly not true. Okay, so another important kind of theoretical root of food justice is critical race theory. And some concepts from critical race theory that I find particularly important, these are not the only ones. So one is this idea of institutional racism. In the US, we tend, and really around the world, we tend to assume that racism means an individual act of meanness. I don't want to hire somebody because they're black or a woman, or, you know, I think that, pregnancy is an inconvenience for employers, or things like that. But it's not just about individual decision making, right? It's also about the ways that racial stratification are written into the policies and processes and economic incentives that govern our country. So something like redlining would be an example of institutional racism, right? The individual loan officer doesn't have to have a dislike for African Americans in order to say, hey, this is a neighborhood in which I'm not allowed to loan money. But the neighborhoods in which loan officers weren't allowed to lend money were African American segregated neighborhoods. Okay. A second concept is intersectionality. So the idea that oppressions and privileges are inextricable from one another. Right? That your position in a racial hierarchy, your position in a class hierarchy, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your national status, all of these things matter in terms of the kinds of material goods that you have access to and the way you see your own cultural identity represented positively or negatively. And that we need to think not only about one dimension of these things, but about the ways that they are tied together. A third concept that I think is really important is racial projects, and it builds on the idea of institutional racism. So social scientists have long said that race is not a biological absolute, right? Race is not something we're born with, but race is socially produced over time. So what racial category you identify with is part of a long-standing process of policies and planning processes and economic processes that have determined who tends to identify with what racial group and how racial groups are positioned vis-a-vis one another. So again, this notion that it's not just about individual acts of meanness, but about a much more complex social reality. Okay, A third, not surprising, element of food justice scholarship is sustainable agriculture. Food justice activists tend to advocate for small-scale, local distribution, organic production methods, right? And food justice activists are no different. When the sustainable agriculture movement really picked up steam in the 90s and 2000s, there's a bunch of scholarship that came out that was very laudatory of their goals and their techniques, saying, you know, this is really a great thing for connecting with the land, for connecting with communities, for environmental sustainability. And a lot of food justice activists are really taken with local sustainable agriculture. But on the other hand, there are critiques of sustainable agriculture that I think are also very important. So the first is that the movement tends to be disproportionately white and wealthy. And that in no way means that low-income people and people of color are not involved in agriculture and are not involved in sustainable agriculture. But if you look at who is trumpeted as the face of the movement, if you look at who gets their picture in the New York Times as the example of the new sustainable farmer, those folks are disproportionately white and wealthy. And also if you look at who's making money off of the sustainable food sector. So that's one critique. And that's a critique that really makes it much more difficult for low-income communities and communities of color to kind of read themselves into the movement for sustainable agriculture, and they tend to feel more left out of it and alienated by it. The other set of critiques revolves around this concept of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, as David Harvey's floating head will tell us, is the political economic philosophy asserting that human well-being can best be achieved through the so-called free market. Neoliberalism is the philosophical underpinning behind such things as free trade, deregulation, the World Trade Organization, things like that. And sustainable agriculture advocates are largely resisting neoliberalism in a lot of ways, right? They're saying, oh, we don't want free trade. What we want is particular communities being able to provide for themselves and for one another, right, in the most environmentally friendly ways. But at the same time, the sustainable agriculture movement reproduces neoliberalism in a couple of really important ways. What I think of as the most important is this notion of market mechanisms. So if you want to be a part of the sustainable food movement, there are two things you usually do. You either become an organic farmer and you attempt to sell locally produced organic food, or you purchase such food, right? And when we have, and either way, your participation in the movement is not necessarily about advocacy, right? It's about economic exchange. So it goes without saying, though, that when the way you participate in a movement is through either your livelihood or your consumption, excuse me, that those with more class privilege are going to be more able to participate, right? If you need to participate, if you're voting with your dollar, then those who have more dollars get more votes. The other is a notion of neoliberal subjectivities. So as we engage in this kind of market as movement, this way of shopping our way to a better society, we are reproducing notions of what it means to be an ethical person through our consumption. And so when the sustainable foods movement tends to say that you are a good person, you are doing a good thing by buying this local organic tomato as opposed to this other tomato, right? Or as opposed to processed food, they are reproducing notions of what it means to be a good and ethical person, and they're doing it in a way that is very much classed, right? So these are critiques of food justice that have come out of critiques of sustainable agriculture that have come out of the academic literature that have been kind of fodder for food justice movement, food justice scholars and activists to build on. The fourth field, very briefly, is food studies. So food studies is a relatively newly emergent interdisciplinary field studying, all aspects of food, from marketing to production to consumption. The field of food studies really teaches us about the ways that food is intertwined with social order and social hierarchies. Through food, we perform various identities and we reproduce or contest various hierarchies. And it generally consists of fine-grained, qualitative, non-essentialist studies. And I hope that as the field of food justice emerges, we get even better at kind of adapting the fine-grained ethnographic eye that comes out of food studies and using it in our understanding of food justice. Okay, so that's the theory. And if you're not a theory person, here's the part of the talk you might be more interested in. I'm going to talk about two examples of food justice research that I think will be particularly interesting to planners and architects. So the first is barriers to healthy eating in low-income communities of color. This is something that lots of food justice folks are writing about and thinking about. The second is looking at my own work on gentrification and urban food systems, and this is going to be the first time I've talked publicly about this, so I'm really interested in feedback and anything you guys have for me related to that. Okay, so barriers to healthy eating in low-income communities of color. Oop, 2 slides. So popular culture tends to talk about given these health disparities, right? People want to know what can be done to help people in low-income communities and communities of color get better eating habits. Popular culture tends to be really regressive on this. It tends to talk about people who suffer from diet-related health problems like heart disease and diabetes as having low motivation or a lack of knowledge, right? If you ask Rush Limbaugh, the problem is that they're all lazy and stupid. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but I think it's an important basis to understand the academic response, which is to be a little bit overly reliant on the structural. So the structural answer is to look at the built environment and to say, okay, what is the food environment for these communities like? Do they have access to all the variety of food choices that they would want to make? And the assumption is that if people, if you build it, they will come, right? If you bring in more food choices, then people will make healthier food choices. But the truth is that the data is mixed on that bringing a grocery store into what gets called a food desert neighborhood doesn't necessarily improve eating behaviors, in part because in that grocery store you can find the same processed food that people were already eating, right? The policy is also mixed. So the food desert argument has led to more support for community gardens and farmers markets and alternative agriculture projects in low-income communities of color. But it's also, in fact, that you could argue that the main beneficiary has been Walmart and other non-unionized grocery stores, because the food desert problem has been conceptualized only as about geographic access. And so the answer has been to incentivize grocery stores to come into these food desert neighborhoods, which has led to stores like Walmart, which have such high profit margins, getting given incentives to locate. And so like I said, you can argue that Walmart is really, you can argue that it's a kind of urban land grab, whereas neighborhoods in these inner cities have have lured in grocery stores. It's actually been a boon to the grocery store, but not necessarily for the folks living in the neighborhood. Okay, so the problems with the structural approach has led to a renewed emphasis on poverty, looking at the expense of healthy food. Those of us who've done focus groups with low-income people know that the most important variable in preventing them from accessing healthy food is not geographic access, it's affordability. So looking at the expense of healthy food, the lack of kitchens, the lack of time to cook, right, which is also part and parcel of poverty. And it's led to a new emphasis on wages. There have been a lot of folks that come out of the food labor sector and also the food movement who have recently come to support things like raising the minimum wage. Also programs to increase how much you can get with your food stamp dollar if you use healthy food. So programs like the Double Up program, which started in Michigan, where if you use your food stamps or your EBT at the farmer's market or other healthy food retailers, you can get matching funds to make your dollar go twice as far. Okay. Then we get to the kind of critical questions. So one of the critical questions I think is really important is, are eating habits that different? Are low-income people, we know that there are health disparities, right? We know that heart disease and diabetes are very strongly correlated with both race and income. But are eating habits as strongly correlated as these health disparities? Are low-income people and middle-class people really eating all that differently from one another? Or is everybody kind of eating relatively poorly? And so there's been some research on this that suggests that eating habits are less different than the health disparities would lead you to believe. So maybe there's something going on here that can't be addressed through changes in individual level behavior. Another kind of larger question is, what is healthy anyway, right? The idea that health is a social construct. Foods that were thought healthy 20 years ago or 50 years ago are generally not thought of as healthy now. I don't know if you guys are New York Times readers, but last week there was a whole to-do because there was an investigative report that showed that the sugar industry had been very active in pressuring the US government and government researchers to conclude that the biggest predictor of diabetes and heart disease was fat consumption, not sugar consumption, right? So we have to think about how the industry has worked food knowledge to its advantage, and whether notions of health have been culturally coded. Has the kind of foods that white people tend to eat been deemed healthy, where foods of other cultural groups have often been demonized as unhealthy when whole cuisines need to be kind of taken apart and looked at more analytically. And then this is kind of all leading us to the question of, is healthy eating the most important predictor of health disparities? So things like, are racial and economic disparities in access to healthcare and treatment, and I should add gender disparities, are these more important than individual level eating decisions in understanding who is suffering from rates of diet-related health problems? And I should also mention, I don't have a slide for this, but the obesogenic, or the epigenetic arguments around healthy eating and health disparities. So the idea that our own eating behaviors are only one of a number of factors that are contributing to these larger patterns. Okay, so that kind of sums up, I put that series of slides in there to give you an idea of how food justice as a research field tends to approach a particular question. What I want to do is change gears and talk a little bit about my own research on gentrification in urban food systems, and like I said, this is very, very preliminary stuff. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you 2 vignettes starring Fat Beats Produce. Fat Beats Produce is a food justice organization in North Oakland. Their programs are pretty typical. They have a farmer's market, farm stands, community gardens, support for entrepreneurs. They are very explicitly committed to racial and economic justice, and that really characterizes all of their initiatives. They're a racially diverse group of largely volunteer organizers, mostly college educated. They're a mix of long-term residents and more recent transplants. So Fat Beats defines the neighborhood it works in as North Oakland, which is a long-standing designation of that neighborhood. But they recently learned that they actually work in NOBI. So NOBI is an acronym for North Oakland, Berkeley, and Emeryville. It's coined by a local realtor, and she did it in a video she made describing why you should move to NOBI. And of course, that video was not aimed at the people who presently live in NOBI, but was aimed largely at people in San Francisco who are moving into Oakland at a rapid rate. So in this video, it was kind of a paragon of new urbanist advertising, I guess. She talked about the neighborhood undergoing a revitalization. She talked about walkability, affordable homes, which in Oakland is $400,000 to $500,000. She talked about the upstart of new cool bars and restaurants, and of course she mentioned a community garden and a farmer's market. The community garden and farmers market were managed by Fat Beats Produce, and they were livid at seeing their work really used as a reason that other people and wealthier people should move into the neighborhood. They responded by putting out a video of their own. They called it Culture Jamming, a response video. Their video was kind of bitterly sarcastic. It's called Neighbors Outing Blatant Exploitation, which of course is also NOBI. I'll give you the link to the video, it's funny. And this video really started a national dialogue on food justice and gentrification. There was some coverage in the New Yorker. There was a lot of communication on listservs of food justice activists in various cities talking about how their dynamics had played out. And Fat Beats was relatively reflexive about this. They recognized that they depend on new residents as volunteers and customers, and many of them themselves are new residents. But their goal was to serve the long-term community who was being pushed out by gentrification. So a few months later, Fat Beats became embroiled in another struggle over gentrification. They were a founding partner of the Crossroads Café, which is in the top left picture. The Crossroads Café was a collaborative of Fat Beats and a bunch of local residents. They raised $75,000 through a Kickstarter to rehab an abandoned building. Members took turns operating the cafe, so I cook Tuesday, you cook Wednesday. We all get to practice having a restaurant without having to invest quite as heavily as if any of us had gone in privately. And Fat Beats ran their kitchen incubator program. They held their farmers market in the parking lot, and they had their CSA pickup, and they have a very large CSA, so it brought a lot of people into the store and really led to whatever success they had. But one of the members of the cooperative who had the lease entirely in her name, this is where they went wrong, and she decided she was frustrated with working with such a big collaborative group, and she sold the lease on Craigslist. And she sold it to Lindsay, who's in the bottom right corner, who has a business called the Grease Box. She had a pop-up in San Francisco for years. She was really excited about having her first retail store. Fat Beats maintained their sublease, so they weren't kicked out by the sale of the lease, but they had a new master tenant that they had to negotiate with, and those negotiations didn't go very well. Greasebox, Lindsay called the police and the health department, and when the sublease expired, they didn't renew it. And so now, I'll go back a slide. So now instead of the Crossroads Cafe on the left, it's the Greasebox on the right, and it's a gluten-free fried chicken restaurant. Okay. So these two vignettes got me really thinking about what gentrification is and how does it impact work on sustainable urban food systems in Oakland. And then how are food businesses and activism in turn affecting gentrification, and what kind of projects win or lose in this rapidly changing city. Okay, so in order to think about these questions, sorry to go back to more theory, we need to think a little bit about what gentrification is. So gentrification is public and private investors targeting spaces for particular development. We tend to know it mostly by its effects. So the effect is that low-income folks of color, are often displaced from the neighborhood, changing its essential character and flavor. Some related concepts out of the academic literature are uneven development, and growth machine are two different ways of talking about how cities pursue capitalist development. And it's worth noting that segregation, divestment, and urban renewal, the planning processes that have so impoverished low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, really set the scene for gentrification by decreasing the land values and making the incentive for the re-engagement of capital so appealing. Okay, so we talk about super gentrification. My colleague Rachel Brahinsky calls it Uber gentrification, which I really like, since Uber is one of the super gentrifiers coming into Oakland. Bankers and financiers, since most of the scholarship comes out of Manhattan, they talk about bankers and financiers in the Bay Area. It's the tech money. Coming in to re-gentrify a previously gentrified area. There's an Onion article, I should have clipped the headline, that says, man wants neighborhood to stay exactly as gentrified as it was when he moved in, right? So the idea that once folks get established in a new neighborhood, they often become a lure, their presence actually becomes a lure for even wealthier folks who then displace the original displacers. And that really leads me to this question that I think we really need to think about in the gentrification literatures. Who are we talking about when we talk about displacement, right? There's two different social practices going on here. There's low-income communities of color that have historically been in these neighborhoods that are being pushed out. And then there's middle-class artists, activists, teachers who are also being pushed out. And while they're both experiencing displacement, and their displacements are linked to one another, they're also in two different positions and experiencing two different sets of dynamics, and with much more harmful consequences to the longstanding residents than to the more recent residents. There's also this notion of green gentrification, that the development of green spaces can be an incentive for capital development. It's most perverse when the new greening is the result of EJ struggles, so long-standing communities who have long had disproportionate exposure to toxic land uses, organize, often for decades, get their neighborhoods cleaned up, only to see their newly cleaned up neighborhood be a lure for capitalist development that then raises rents and pushes them out. And so one of the things this research is asking is whether Oakland's sustainable food and food justice movement is creating green gentrification from the bottom up. So I should mention that some of this work is co-authored with Josh Kaji, who's another one of my graduate students and one of the organizers of food, the founding organizers of Fat Beats. And he started looking at these dynamics in his master's thesis. We've co-authored a couple of pieces, and now I'm taking his work and expanding it to think about the city more generally, and also to think beyond just food justice organizations, but also I'm starting to talk to chefs and restaurateurs, and I'm really interested in talking to people in the food tech world, who I think are the real beneficiaries in terms of sustainable food systems encounter with gentrification, but I don't know those folks, so that's going a little bit slower. So I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of gentrification. Even long-term residents of West Oakland, I was just rereading an interview from this research last night, and even long-term residents of West Oakland, some of them are very pro-gentrification because they see it as a harbinger of jobs. And they think that there needs to be some investment in their neighborhood because there's been no investment in their neighborhood for decades. So I think it's worth talking about the benefits of gentrification for sustainable food system and food justice work in Oakland. So the number and notoriety of mid to high-end restaurants, especially those sourcing local organic food. A lot of the chefs are trained at Chez Panisse, which is a very upscale restaurant in Berkeley that has long sourced local organic produce. Oakland was named the 7th best food city in the country by USA Today. And you'll notice, if we kind of go through this quote relatively quickly, that they're serving up, the very last line says that they're serving up the best of local farms. So this emphasis on restaurants that are working on local and working with local and organic food stuff. And I should mention that almost all the examples that they mention are cuisines that come out of communities of color, right? Ramen, Mumbai street food. Miss Ali's is a Caribbean restaurant. Cosecha is a Mexican restaurant. Also, gentrification has brought new interest in urban farming. And in fact, urban farming, much like the Nobi video, is often used as a lure for gentrifiers. So 35 reasons you need to move to Oakland from a real estate blog. Was that a farm you just walked past? Yep, Oakland is a hot spot for urban farming with entire communities coming together to raise crops. Right? There are also benefits for food justice organizations. This is Mandela Marketplace. It's a worker-owned cooperative grocery store in West Oakland. All of the worker owners are long-term residents, African-American, low-income folks. And they talk about the new white residents of their neighborhood being important customers to keep the business afloat. So James Burke, who's one of the worker owners, talks about how Caucasian people help keep the blood of the business flowing. There are cheap properties getting bought up and renovated, and now white people are living in it, and it's definitely benefiting us. You're seeing a new kind of mentality move into the neighborhood, right? These people know what we're selling. They want to come to the co-op. They want to eat. They want to support this business. They want to eat this kind of food. And if James ever hopes to make substantial profits from this co-op, he's going to need folks who want to shop there and who have lots of disposable income to do so. This is another example, Top Leaf Farm. This is Ben Fajera, the farmer who's in the background here. Ben's whole business plan revolves around creating rooftop farms on new developments. And Ben is a contractor and a farmer, and he has developed a specialty in the design and building of rooftop urban farms. He's been working with one developer called the Nautilus Group. They're on their 3rd project together. And the goal is to create a cooperatively owned urban farm that works on the roof of these businesses and sells all the produce within 3 miles. He wants to do delivery via bicycle. It's kind of an interesting idea. One of his board members is Esperanza Palanta. We'll see her in the next slide. And she is the former head of the Oakland Food Policy Council. And she's really involved in pushing both the Nautilus Group and developers more generally to reserve some of the retail space in their new projects for community-owned businesses. And so Esperanza says, if there's going to be retail and food involved in your greater project, link to the businesses that are in fact helping to lift up the communities most impacted by food insecurity. It's saying, hey, you know what, actually we're moving into the city, we're going to have a presence, but it doesn't mean that your project has to be a force that further creates more suffering, but rather it can be a part of the community solution, right? By having a lot of this new retail space be available to longstanding community members who want to start food-based businesses. And one of the businesses she's pushing is Red Bay Coffee. That's a picture that didn't come out very well of Keva Conte, the founder in the background. It's a Black-owned business. All of the employees are people of color. Some are formerly incarcerated, and their retail locations, which they have 2 of, have profit sharing where the folks who work there share in all the profits, although the bulk of their sales come through their wholesale business, including, I just learned that they're going to be the official coffee of Uber once they move to Oakland. So those are some of the benefits, right? Some businesses, some food justice program or projects are doing very well because of gentrification. But there's also risks of displacement. So Africatown is a community garden rooted in a black radical neighborhood initiative. So according to Linda Grant, who's a very active participant in this initiative, it's an autonomous zone for Africans to come together and gather, share resources, organize the community against gentrification, countercultural, against capitalism and colonialism, combating gentrification, right? These are not people who just want to develop a business. What they did was they cleaned up an abandoned lot next door to a community center in a very rough neighborhood of Oakland that had been earmarked for development in the most recent city plan. There is some discrepancy about how they got the permit to be able to do this work, but from their point of view, they did apply for a permit. The owner did not show up to contest it, and they do have one. They're now being sued by the owner who wants to sell the plot for $1 million. He paid $200,000, so there's good return on investment, and he wants to clear them out because he knows that nobody is going to want to buy the land when they think there's going to be this conflict around whether they can get to do what they want to do with it. And so far he's shown up with police. He has tried suing individual gardeners, and these are incredibly low-income people. Excuse me. None of this has yet been successful, but neither has Africatown created any long-term tenure for themselves. Thank you. Another program that's risking displacement is the Self-Help Hunger Program. This is founded by Auntie Frances Moore, who's the woman in the middle of the photo. What it does is provide a free community meal once a month for whoever's around, but she feeds a lot of homeless people. It's in a rapidly gentrifying location. In fact, it's in Nobi. And there have been neighbor complaints about music, drugs, which I've never seen anything besides pot there, and I've been there a bunch of times, but there's a lot of complaints about people dealing drugs, bathrooms, and actually what I mean by that is the lack of bathrooms, so people who don't have bathrooms sometimes urinating. There have been lots of calls to the police. The police are there pretty much every week. According to Kedar, who's a long-term neighborhood resident and an activist, he says the city has a 20-year plan of how they want the city to be. They want this jogway from Port Richmond to Jack London Square. They're going to use eminent domain for things like the Wood Street project, which is an all-solar community development. I think this is part of the agenda, that they want to clean this area out and make it look different. I think the new residents want to turn the plaza into a dog poop park so that they can walk their dogs and come here. Then eventually, after they get rid of everybody, they can make it look nice. Right? So again, this is this idea of green gentrification, of who has access to which kind of space. And as gentrification comes in, does it create more hardships for the food justice initiatives that are taking root? And even when the organizations themselves are not at risk of being displaced, many of the organizations have found that the community members they've been working with for a long time may not be able to stay in Oakland. And so they've been building relationships with low-income folks, folks of color who are long-term residents of Oakland, who then are displaced. So Sabrina Wu, who's the ED of the Hope Collaborative, which is another organization, says many of our long-term members who've been with us for years have been impacted by the housing crisis. And for her, the main impact is that they've had to look at their criteria for how they connect with residents and who can be a part of the Hope Collaborative. But of course, she recognizes that whether or not they can be a part of the collaborative is small beans compared to their greater livelihoods and state of being. Okay, so to sum up, there's new opportunities for food businesses, especially restaurants, also these food tech businesses. Some benefits for food justice organizations, particularly new customers and supporters. And organizations that are the most rooted in the long-term community are the most vulnerable. The kind of silver lining is that activists are using food as an organizing tool to push back against gentrification. So they've argued successfully in terms of jobs for long-term community members. Red Bay is not the only food business that has emerged and that is doing very well because of gentrification, that is employing low-income youth of color in their food service work. In fact, even profit sharing. So we have, again, back to Mandela Cooperative. Burke grew up here, talking about James Burke, who was on the previous slide about Mandela. And Mandela Marketplace is going to become profitable, and he's going to get a share of those profits and be able to afford to stay in West Oakland. So this idea that as gentrification happens, some of these businesses are creating ways for long-term community members to avoid displacement. There's also the entrepreneurial opportunities like Red Bay, and there is some more limited work in the policy and planning sphere. So this is the table of contents for the city's healthy development guidelines. They have not yet adopted these, but it's important to note that I don't know how to make the red dot happen, that it's not only things like transportation and food, but also access to affordable housing, if you look in H on the right side, and preserving existing affordable housing. This is not something that's long been thought of as part of health, but it's a very expanded, dynamic notion of health that if the city adopts these guidelines and implements them in a meaningful way, might be very useful in avoiding further gentrification. There's also community activism coming out of the food sector. So there's increasing support for tenants' rights groups like CJJC is Causa Justa Just Cause. They are probably the premier tenants' right group in the Bay Area, and they recently passed a moratorium on rent increases in Oakland. So they've been really successful at doing some of the work that's going to be really necessary to stem displacement. There's also interest in food and housing hybrids like land trusts. There's a project in Boston that everybody really wants to emulate called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, where the land trust owns the land. They've built affordable housing on it. And there's also space for urban farms and community gardens on that same plot of land. So food justice and housing justice become much more coterminous. And so that's where people would like to go. Of course, the question remains, as Oakland is gentrifying so rapidly, whether any of this will have a chance to take effect before we all sell our houses or get pushed out by tech workers. All right, so thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to get to talk to you guys today. And I look forward to a little bit of discussion.
We have time for some few questions and comments for Professor Alkon.
Hi. So I have a question about the speed at which these kinds of redevelopment efforts tied to food justice have to happen. You talked about the example of the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston.
Yeah.
And they did for the first 10 years of their existence, all they did was they were reorganizing. That's all they did. They were heavily criticized at the time for that. And it took quite a long time to actually achieve the kind of thing that you see now, which I think is at least 20 years later. So they've been around for 30 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that took a long time. And so I wonder about the timelines of these other community development projects in neighborhoods that are quickly gentrifying. And so could we talk a little bit about those dynamics?
Yeah, and wow. I think the pace of gentrification is so rapid right now in the Bay Area. And I've heard in Columbus as well, it's happening in a lot of places. Actually, the land trust got funds through the stimulus about 10 years ago. to be able to buy properties in Oakland for things like this. But just as those funds were made available, housing prices in the Bay Area went through the roof. And so the amount of properties the Land Trust has been able to buy has been very minimal. So I don't know that it's a realistic response.
When things are bad is when you have to act.
Buy quick. And some of it, I don't know what I haven't checked in with folks at the Land Trust in a little while, but there are some parts of East Oakland that are not very heavily gentrified yet. So it might make more sense for them to think about a project in the neighborhood that's still rough, and that's still predominantly people of color and high crime, rather than trying to come in to the really gentrified, not gentrifying, but gentrified neighborhoods in North and West Oakland. And there's also the question of when they talk about affordable housing, affordable for whom, right? And I feel like what the Land Trust has been doing so far is talking about housing that'll be affordable for the, in Oakland, very racially diverse group of kind of middle-class teachers, artists, and activists who are also being pushed out of the city. But it's not Section 8 housing. It's not Section 8 kinds of rates. And they're looking for people, yeah. So I don't know that that's a real practical solution, but it is something folks are really interested in, and I think the fact that food folks are really thinking about housing very seriously is promising, even if it's not going to actually come to fruition.
So I'm interested in those healthy development guidelines.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they are, as they say, just guidelines. And so how often are they followed?
Oh, this is a draft. It's not even adopted by the city yet. In fact, I felt like it was kosher to just put the table of contents up on a slide, but I'm not even supposed to share them yet.
Okay. Will they be enforced in any way if they do come?
I'm not even sure they'll be adopted, to be honest. But after such a depressing talk, I need something to talk about how people are doing something interesting. And I do think, the Hope Collaborative, the Oakland Food Policy Council have been very active in the process of creating these guidelines. And if we, and really I mean me, if I want to see food activists doing something more than creating alternative markets, I can't slam down everything they're trying to do. So even though I think both of these critiques make a lot of sense.
What do you think the impact of things like the public food forest in Seattle is going to have on food justice, if anything?
I think it'll create some energy and excitement around food justice. I think that particularly in immigrant communities, the practice of kind of grabbing publicly available food is still strong. So I think, in some ways it can ameliorate the most dire impact of food justice. And the food forests are a lot of fruit, which is, I think, really great. Low-income people, when you ask them what they would most like to spend money on that they can't afford, fruit is up there. It's not vegetables, it's fruit, because their kids will eat fruit. And so I do think that, it can help a little bit. I don't think it's going to get anybody to either healthy eating behaviors or economic stability in a way that can even be a game changer at that individual level, let alone the community level.
Is it true with the urban farms as one of the selling points of gentrification? So is that once gentrification starts occurring, is there pressure to maintain the urban farms, or do you wind up with the housing, land prices going up to the point where
Mostly the latter. San Francisco has some legislation around giving tax incentives for folks with land that hasn't been developed to stay an urban farm. And a couple of properties have made use of it, but for the most part, those urban farms are on land that is not on the market for one reason or another. Some cases like Africatown, where I showed you, the land is literally not on the market because there's a farm there, and the owner thinks that he needs to get rid of the farm before he can put the land on the market. Other cases, food justice organizations are farming they have partnerships with Oakland Parks and Rec, so they're farming on city-owned land that's not going to be sold. 2 organizations in Oakland have managed to buy land in the past year, so they're not going to be worried about that. But I think for the most part, the profit margin is the profit in, not margin, but incentive is just too strong. Yeah.
Two components, actually. What is the engagement of the local food movement in Oakland look like with the Oakland City government or other local government entities? And then on the other, going the other direction, what is the interaction between the Oakland urban food justice movement and any connection with, say, rural development and adjacent farming communities? I'm not familiar with the geography of the area.
Sure. So there are some organizations doing both of those things, but they're not the same organization. So the Hope Collaborative and the Oakland Food Policy Council, which is formed in conjunction with the city government, are very active in partnering with city government to affect local policy. To some degree, they've done that to the benefit of local food entrepreneurs. So one of the things they've done is make it, it used to be illegal, and the city started cracking down on very small, privately owned plots of land that were trying to sell a little bit of produce off their land. They made the mistake of busting a former graduate student of Michael Pollan's named Novella Carpenter, who's written a book called Farm City. She's very kind of well-loved in the sustainable food scene, and she got very involved in efforts with the Food Policy Council to make it legal to have a farm, to have a farm stand. So at that level of food policy, food justice organizations are very involved. In terms of larger questions, more kind of weighty issues for policy, the truth is that even though there are so many foodies in Oakland, they don't have a lot of political power. And in terms of the interface with rural development, most people in Oakland who are working in Oakland are focused on Oakland, so that's where they want their contribution to be. Certainly there are efforts to build links with regional farmers. Fat Beats in particular works almost exclusively, I think, with farmers of color who don't have access to the kind of wealthier farmers markets in the Bay Area, most of whom don't use, they say they use organic practices, but they can't afford certification. I tend to believe them. And so there is some effort towards creating those partnerships. In terms of a broader concept of rural development, there's not much. Though maybe as more Oakland activists end up moving out of the city, that'll be an unintended consequence.
So I'm just thinking about all the different sort of like projects that seem related to food justice. And then there's the whole aspect of community organizing through those projects equals food justice. I'm just trying to figure out how, or is anyone figuring out a way to lift up, to sort of pull all these disparate projects together in a way that there's a more robust, more potentially activist way of, dealing with these larger, big lever issues. And, an Oakland might be an overall big pilot project. The community organizing aspect of food work is potentially, to me, always been very powerful and underutilized.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what you think about that relative to what the potential is and where are we missing the boat? I mean, we work with a lot, I work with local food system issues here for 20 years and there's a lot of people who have been activated and involved, but in terms of where all that relates to the bigger issues of poverty and investigating the kind of capitalism we have, it's just I feel like we're missing something.
Yeah. I would argue that one of the reasons those connections aren't made is the reliance on market mechanisms. And so on market mechanisms, like participating by buying and selling local organic food or growing your own, all of which are great things to do. But I think that there's been too much attention paid to that and not enough paid to kind of, I don't want to say naming your opponent, finding a target, whether it's, reducing the amount of pesticides being used, whether it's increasing the amount of money spent on food stamps, whether it's, extending. I saw a call recently, there was an author on The Daily Show the other day who wrote about poverty being experienced, food insecurity being experienced by college students. And one of her solutions was to expand the National School Lunch Program to universities. Right? These are like bigger scale solutions. And I think that your local farmers market or CSA or community garden should be a place that you learn and get organized into these bigger efforts. What tends to happen, I think, is that even when you find organizations doing that next scale work, right, something like Real Food Challenge, which I know has been really active on this campus, they organize and they bridge from one place to another, but they're still working at that local scale of like, what does your daily food environment look like? And maybe your daily food environment isn't the best place to start making changes, right? Maybe you need to take on a bigger target. And even as I say that, I'm like, oh, but I can see how intimidating that is.
Wait, I couldn't hear, I'm sorry.
Even as I say that, I'm thinking, oh, but I can see how intimidating that is. Like, if it takes so much effort just to get your university to purchase local, which is one of the campaigns I've been hearing about here, right? If it takes so much energy to get to that, then think about what it's going to take to, like, increase funding for food stamps or increase, people are getting involved. One of the things Julie and I are writing about in the new book that's coming out next summer is efforts to get involved with increasing wages. Because if we care so much about low-income people's access to healthy food, what's been actually proven to increase healthy eating choices is not whether there's a grocery store in their neighborhood, but increasing their wages. So I think, the fact that foodie writers, like popular food writers, have been talking about the fight for 15 really explicitly is amazing. 10 years ago, Michael Pollan told a friend of mine that labor has no place in the food movement, and he doesn't think that anymore. And I'm really happy about that. Now he's coming out and writing about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers from time to time.
Well, when you think about environmental justice, one of the things to me that was powerful was that there were real campaigns. And campaigns from small, tiny communities in Ohio, like Spencerville, Ohio, under 1,000 people, to major cities where there was campaigns. And that's one of the things I think in the food movement we haven't done is work on developing campaigns.
Right, because it's a very kind of post-political, no enemy, right? We don't need to take on agribusiness. We're going to just let it do let it do its thing, and we'll create our alternative, and eventually, somehow, agribusiness will collapse. There's a Diane DePrima poem that I really love that talks about earthworms burrowing under the soil until things collapse, right? And I always think of that as a metaphor for how the food movement thinks about itself. And it's not going to collapse through attrition, right? Capitalism is way too powerful. It needs to be explicitly taken on. And I don't know what the best first target is, but I think there should be a target.